lovelies. Today we're going to take a look at Warpstar, a little indie RPG by Fire Ruby Designs. You may recall Warlock, which is the fantasy version of basically the same system, which is rooted in nostalgia for 1980s British RPGs, really. Warlock is very much rooted in fighting fantasy and Warhammer Fantasy roleplay and that kind of gaming culture that we had here in the UK at the time. And this is the science fiction version. Now, it lacks the cramped, grubby charm that Warlock has. This is a much cleaner, brighter, lighter sort of book, and as such, yeah, it does lack a great deal of the charm that Warlock had. Too much white space, not enough art, in my opinion, not enough of the right kind of art, in my opinion, and as a result of all of that, it's just not really as effective as Warlock is. I mean, it is harder to give a game that same kind of blended early Warhammer 40,000 sort of feel, because that intellectual property, despite having ripped off so many other sources, has such a strong presence and identity in the gaming world. Everyone is familiar, at least in passing, with Warhammer 40,000, and even though it took from Nemesis the Warlock, Judge Dredd, Dune, and a whole bunch of other sources, it dominates the space so absolutely thoroughly that it's hard to draw on the same sources without being sort of drawn into its orbit or necessarily compared with it. Now, nonetheless, you will find a lot of the same sort of elements throughout this book and throughout its mostly implicit background. There's a powerful autocracy. There are feudal lords ruling over planets or clusters of planets. There's a powerful military with a power-armoured elite. So all of that's still there. Aliens aren't necessarily treated as badly, though. There are plenty of aliens in the universe, and you don't just have to oppressively wipe them all out. Now, system-wise, we're looking at pretty much the same as Warlock, which is the bastard offspring of fighting fantasy and Warhammer. You have multiple skills, whereas in, say, fighting fantasy, you just have a skill stat. You have a stamina score, which is determined randomly, and you have luck. There aren't any stats per se, so everything is based off skills, which, as I've noted before, is a bit of a trend in a lot of games lately. Characters also start off with talents. These are special features, but this is really the only way that you have to possibly represent yourself as a sub-breed of humanity or an alien species or a robot or things like that. Talents is really the only way you have to do that, and those talents include things like Fist of Stone, making your unarmed attacks more damaging and more effective, acute hearing, killer instinct, all of that sort of stuff. Killer instinct raises your crit damage by 2. It's all this sort of thing. And when you go to do stuff, you roll a d20, you add your skill level, and you try to get over 20, at least under normal circumstances, and your highest starting skill is somewhere around 12, I think. So that's going to give you slightly better than 50-50 odds on something you're particularly good at. This can be modified by bonuses and penalties, shifting the end result. So, -5, +5, all of that sort of thing. Combat works pretty much on the same way as you might be familiar with from Warlock. And from the skill system I just described, hits reduce your stamina, armor protects against stamina loss. When you're out of stamina, you take progressively worse critical hits depending how far below zero your stamina has dropped, and then eventually you will necessarily die, having taken a lot of hideous injuries. There are spacecraft rules, and those could be taken a bit more broadly as vehicle rules with a little bit of fiddling around, but vehicle rules themselves are slightly mystifyingly absent, but you can work it out. The implicit setting here has magic in the form of strange warp energy, and this can be channeled through glyphs to manifest effects at the risk of mutation or blowback. The ship rules, you get a bit of implicit setting there. Every ship has an artificial mind, an AI, which can run all the ship's basic functions, which solves the problem of you having to leave a character behind in the ship to get you out of trouble if you run into problems. But then you enhance that by having people at particular crew stations, science stations, scanning stations, pilots, gunners, all of that sort of thing. So the actual setting itself is squeezed into the back of the book. You can see the 40k influence a little bit more strongly there. The Dune influence through a mystic drug called Cadence, which is warp-tainted and which extends lifespans. It's a big universe, though. There's enough room for you to do pretty much what you want with it. And as a generic, less than hard sci-fi sort of rule set and so on, it's perfectly cromulent. And that's really, unfortunately, all there is to say about it, for the most part. I said vehicle rules were strangely absent. It's more that it focuses very, very tightly in on ships rather than vehicles, really. You know, there's a bit on them, but it is focused on ships. You'd kind of expect that, but you do get a few examples, but it's not really much, especially compared to the ships. I haven't finished flipping through, but I'm ready to give you scores now. Style-wise, give it a 3, average for an indie product. It very definitely lacks the cohesive style and the dirty charm of Warlock. Some of this score is probably down to me being very familiar with a lot of the stock art that has been used. And that has created a sense, for me, going through the book, of it being like a starter project or a first project, which didn't radiate off Warlock to the same degree, but I think the Warlock game was a special edition or something. The problem that this has is that it really kind of lacks a unique selling point and a niche of its own, while Warlock sits neatly in that fighting fantasy, Warhammer, FRP nostalgia, and the feel of a lot of early fan magazines, you know, early issues of Valkyrie or GMI or even White Dwarf. Warpstar doesn't. And it'll take a lot more work as a games master to extract and create an appropriate look, feel, and texture to the game. So approaching it as a toolkit increases its value. And that's the way I would probably end up using it. Substance-wise, I'm going to give it a 3 as well, average. It would be churlish of me to criticise the game for largely having an implicit background rather than an explicit one, given that was my approach in Machinations, and I think this compares quite flatteringly to both with MOTSP. But it is less effective at it, in my not-so-humble opinion. Less effective in bringing out the feel of their implicit world, and some of that is down to the use of stock art, which doesn't necessarily reflect their visual values and what they were really going for here. I think back to the original Rogue Trader skirmish game, you know, the first edition of Warhammer 40,000, and how every single page dripped with cues, clues, and visual or textual artifacts that drew you in to that world that they'd created. And Warpstar doesn't do that. So that's an issue here. I'm getting back into visual design more. Been doing a lot of layouts. That's probably my brain desperately rebelling and trying not to be bored, but it does mean that I'm more sensitive to that at the moment. Still, regardless, so that means overall we've got a deeply average score of 3 out of 5 or 6 out of 10 as a toolkit. And if you liked Warlock a lot, fab. Or if you want a lighter version of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay and want to apply it to science fiction, if you liked the Fantasy Flight Warhammer 40,000 games, but you want something a bit lighter and easier to use, then great. Otherwise, not so much. It's not all their fault. I don't think SF Gaming has that same strong set of identifiers that Fantasy Gaming has, and I can't think of any particularly outstanding independent British sci-fi games of the period. Yeah, there isn't that same sense, that same feel, or that same common thread that you see across Fighting Fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, Dragon Warriors, and a few others. You just can't say that for science fiction gaming, or British science fiction gaming of the period. It is what it is, that's fine, but for me this was somewhat empty calories. There's no there. I think they should do a new edition, taking a look at the other Warlock editions that they've done, and hone in on the same things that elevated Warlock, made it more effective and better. But yeah, obviously in space. The other thing that I think has had me score it down is that they haven't really had a way to approach aliens and robots and so on in a way that actually kind of makes sense. You know, where in Machinations of the Space Princess I made that integral to character creation and opened it up to all sorts of possibilities. Their approach, which is equally valid in its own way, is to just ignore all that and have you just make up a character in whatever way you want, regardless of what species or whatever they are, and just cope with it that way, which is valid, but it's not my taste. Zang.
Greetings, Jerkian warrior elite. Know this, that your existence is down to the orders of our portly potentate, and that without him you would not exist. Your very conception in the clone tanks of Clonius, the cloning planet, is ordained by his obese omnipotence, and from that very moment you owe him your life, your servitude, and your loyalty. To be a soldier in the glorious army of the Jerkian Empire is perhaps the best fate that can befall lowly matter in this universe. The Jerkian Empire is all-conquering, all-powerful, has the best uniforms, the most advanced weaponry, and the greatest leader the galaxy has ever known. Nothing can stand in our way, and you, even as lowly as you are, can die knowing that you are serving a far greater cause and a far superior people to any other in the universe.
Invaderz is a comedy game of mishap and alien adventure, where you play the part of diminutive and comedically and epically incompetent alien invaders. You can get it at post-mort.com and drive-through RPG.